At We Heart Giant Robots, I mean either that or Patlabor. Patlabor, Blue Gender, Macross plus when. Do Patlabor, you fuckers! Also another missed opportunity to watch Patlabor. Gunhead. Gonna hold you to that next review promise. It's either that or Patlabor, the movies in the series. Preemptive comment for when I watch it in 3 hours. Sight Unseen review, 10 out of 10. Not enough Patlabor or Robot Carnival. Patlabor on a whim back when also there was still a Virgin Megastore in Belfast. Also enjoyed. If I told you David Lynch directed Patlabor on this channel.
Right, fine. Well, fucking do Patlabor, I guess.
So Dave, we're now recording the fan-requested Patlabor.
By popular demand, we are finally... I've been getting extremely stressed because I keep watching our sub count not go anywhere because it's like, oh, weird. If we don't do things that people want to watch, people don't watch it. Who could have ever figured out such a mystery?
Who cares? I'm not here for money anyway.
It's probably a good thing, let's be real here. For nearly a year or so going back, we have comments demanding that we do Patlabor, and finally we've got round to it, which goes to show how crap we are at, getting these things out in a timely fashion. But there you go. What can you do?
We could, record videos timely, watch series on time, review things that fans request, and actually try and run a YouTube channel.
Yeah, Rob, that would be nice, wouldn't it? Us recording in a timely fashion. That'd be fucking fabulous, wouldn't it? I'd love that. The fact that you have the webcam on now just makes that even more fucking annoying. Anyway, yes, so by popular demand, we are going to be covering Patlabor.
David Lynch's Patlabor.
It actually makes more sense than that would work. If David Lynch ever did a mecha series, I feel like it would come out not dissimilar to what Oshii does with his work. So yeah, you're probably wondering which of the Patlabors we are covering. All of it. Literally all of it. And by all of it, I mean most of it, because I'm not watching the live action series. Patlabor is fantastic in its own right, and also a textbook example of how a group of savvy professionals can avoid some of the major pitfalls within the anime industry. But it's also a product of Mamoru Oshii, which means it's absolutely chock full of references and allegories for Japan's history and its political situation in the late 80s and early 90s. Not to mention the fact that there's just so much of it that it can be tricky to know where exactly to start. So we're not out to review Patlabor exactly. What we're trying to do is give you guys a solid overview of the franchise so you know where to jump in at, as well as the context and historical background needed to get the most out of it all. So we will start with the manga, we will move on to the original video animation, we'll do the first movie, then the TV series and its OVA, then Patlabor 2, and then also, I guess, Patlabor the movie 3, although I feel that one we're kind of drifting into the territory of who cares.
The way I've always produced Patlabor is everything is contained within its own timeline. So the manga is the manga, the early days, the TV show is the TV show, the films are the films. The characters are all the same or similar, and they're kind of like, the characters stay the same, but the stories change. And it's not even changed as in this character reacted differently, so a slightly different story. No, it's just the character plays that role in the film. It's like how you used to get old films where it'd be Elvis Presley or Frank Sinatra in it, and they played Elvis Presley or Frank Sinatra. And that's the best way to describe Patlabor. These old style movies where it was these characters are set actors within the series.
Goto is always going to do Goto stuff.
Noah is always going to do Noah stuff.
Yeah, she will be enthusiastic and give her labor a nickname, that sort of thing.
And Ota is going to be Arlie Emery from Full Metal Jacket.
It's going to be a K poster, yeah.
The moods of spooky Ori.
To get back to Patlabor, we're kind of in a near future universe, I guess you could say. We've got things like climate change beginning to become an issue. Technology has advanced to the point that you now have these mechanical robots or industrial robots known as labors, which are being used in Japan to build what is described as this Babylon project, which is apparently going to be some sort of barrier system that's going to stop the sea from rising too much and destroying whole cities. But it's causing all of these industrial strikes, it's causing all of these environmental activists to become very active and to start protesting. And so you're starting to see a rise in labor crime where they use robots to do shenaniganery, shall we say. And so as a result, the police have started to create special units who use their own labors to combat these labor crimes, hence patrol labors, or Patlabors for short.
The other thing to remember with Patlabor, as Dave said there, that is the setting. Everything else is just stories. There's not an overarching story for Patlabor, even within the series, generally speaking. The unit will get better at being a unit, but that's about the height of of character and plot progression.
I think some elements kind of flow into it. Like you see some continuity between the movies at any rate. But aside from that, yeah, you're right. These are all, even if they're technically part of the same timeline, they are still very much self-contained. Like for instance, in the OVA, you've got the final 2 episodes of the original run, which is, you know, the SB2's Longest Day, where it is a coup attempt by radical militarists within the Japanese self-defense forces. If that's part of the same timeline as what happens in, like, say, Patlabor 2, you'd think that the military and the government would be more alert to the idea of, oh, hey, this might be a coup by the army, like what they did, I don't know, a year or 2 ago. So.
And, like, the TV series and the OVA share, like, there's episodes with very similar plots. They don't repeat, though. They're just similar concepts, I think would be the right way to put it.
I think, yeah, they take a similar kind of theme or storyline, but they'll do it a different way each time. Like, for instance, Patlabor 2 is based on the 2-episode arc from the OVA, but it goes in a very different direction, has different themes, and tries to tell a different story in some ways, but it still has sort of common elements.
And a lot of time with Patlabor, like, to describe it as slice of life, it's not an insult to it. It's very much, it's like seeing a day in the life of a police unit and what they're having to deal with on a daily basis within universe.
Oh man, now I want to see this as like a variant of Cops or something.
Well, that's the thing, is if Cops was about when this was made, that's what it would copy in a way.
Not too many characters in Patlabor to worry about, and they all pop up in one form or another across the OVAs and TV series and movies, so we'll run through them just quickly. First up, we've got Noa Izumi, who's probably filling the role of protagonist the most in Patlabor, though this isn't always the case. She's your bubbly, enthusiastic protagonist girl that you saw in a lot of anime from around this time. Think Nariko from Gunbuster, but not horribly depressed. She's super into labors to the point of giving the one she pilots a nickname, and she gets really mad when someone damages it during a fight. Next up, we've got Asuma Shinohara, who's the son of a labor manufacturing CEO who got all rebellious and joined the police. He's a bit of a slacker, doesn't take things too seriously, but he's actually a pretty good coordinator and support person for Noah when he puts his mind to it. And he actually shows a bit of talent as a detective in the first movie as well, and he's best pals with Noah throughout most of the series. We've got Hiromi Yamazaki, who's basically a big, gentle giant who joined the unit even though he's too big to fit into a labor. So he usually acts as one of the drivers when he's not lugging around some huge weapon and shooting them in, like, the climactic firefight. We've got Isao Ota, who is the other pilot for the unit and the aforementioned K-poster.
He's described as being an ex-Marine with a military-style attitude to police work, I believe is the quote.
By military style, do you mean literally just shoot it until it stops being a problem? Because that's
What's
kind
the
of...
quote in the second film? He wanted to round up all the cadets and march in Tokyo himself.
You've got Mikiyasu Shinji, who is down bad for his wife, as the kids say these days. That's it. That's his personality. He's Ota's backup and coordinator, and I think he does some computer shit at one point. Then we've got Kanako Clancy, who pops up in the OVA, the TV series, and the first movie. She's an American police officer on secondment to the unit and is basically one of those stoic, dangerously efficient types you get in stories, who also gets to deliver one of the best lines in any mecha film ever.
Sightseeing?
No. Combat.
You have got Captain Goto. He's a really interesting character, actually. Of all the characters in this, he's probably my favorite, because he's this very sly, underhanded, skullduggerous sort of man who is always tricking his squad into doing various things or finding ways to work around his incompetent superiors by tricking them into doing what he wants them to do. So he's a lot of fun to watch. And we should also mention Shinobu Nagamo, since she's so important to the second movie. She's the captain of Special Vehicles Division 1, which is basically the more professional unit of labor officers, and she can usually be seen helping Goto out of some problem he's found himself in. She's an interesting character to boot, because she's this super professional and well-respected officer who still found herself in a dead-end post with the Patlabors, because, you know, plot reasons. One thing we should mention about Special Vehicles Unit is it's kind of like the dumping ground for all of the weirdos and maniacs within Tokyo's police. Like, it's not considered a very prestigious place to go.
Division 1 is the prestigious unit, and Division 2 is, who are these fucking klutzes? Let's send them on literally hunting ghosts.
Good episode.
Multiple episodes. It's the classic sci-fi element of, they're the elite of the elite. but they're also a bunch of jackasses. Like, they're given the absolute bare minimum, and they still prove themselves to be right all the time.
I mean, they've got cool robots, but that's basically all they have going for them.
It's actually a very common thing in like late 80s and early 90s anime and sci-fi in general, was like they're a bunch of ragtag reprobates that are given on their last chance.
And yet they're given the brand new Ingrams that are super fancy and stuff.
I'm trying to think of like other examples of that, and it's like the Rogue Squadron books as well as Wraith Squadron books, like the Star Wars X-Wing stuff. It's a very common thing in sci-fi.
Nerd.
Deal with it. You hired me literally to be the guy who brings up weird shit to discuss things.
I don't think I've ever hired you.
Too late. I can't leave.
And this is one thing that we should mention as well. Patlabor has more tonal shifts than I can remember seeing in any anime recently. Like it's...
Well, it's like I said, the elements of the show, like the characters, the setting, is similar in all the series. It's more like a vehicle for storytelling. Patlabor, you could write any story and fit the characters into it kind of idea. Like if you wanted a Lovecraftian fucked up episode, you could probably write it with Patlabor.
They do that with the third movie.
Why?
Don't know. They can take it to all sorts of weird and wacky places, and they do regularly. There isn't really a consistent tone, even between episodes of like the OVA and from what you've told me between the TV series as well. It just kind of, what do we feel like doing today?
It's this really interesting way of doing a series. In the like creation chronology, I think the TV series is technically a prequel to the first film.
That would kind of make sense, I guess, but I've also read in a couple places that like the TV series takes place in its own timeline completely.
Yeah, basically. Like, it's fucked up. Welcome to Patlabor, where the series is really simple, but you know, the production is fucked.
And there's no consistency whatsoever. Don't worry about it. Just enjoy the comfy drama.
It's fun.
But that brings us quite nicely on to discussing the guys who make the shenanigans, because they're a really interesting and quite unique bunch in the world of anime. Because if you're looking behind the scenes at like the actual production of series and shows and the money that goes into it and where rights go and things like that, all too often you see situations where the guys who make this stuff kind of get the raw end of the deal very often. Tomino, very famous example.
Fucking Anno. Like,
yeah, poor old Anno had a very bad time with it. And very often it's because someone creates something and as part of the deal for getting it, you know, made and animated, because bizarrely enough, it costs quite a lot of money to put one of these things together. You have to take your idea to various different production houses and companies and corporations, and they want certain things in return, like, you know, the rights to the series. And if you sign those over, it doesn't always go your way.
that's an extremely common thing in not just anime, but in most like entertainment productions in Japan. Like just look at the Idols, for example. Like, they are owned by a company. They aren't like a band per se. They are put together and manufactured completely. And like, anime is very similar as well. It's a very complicated industry in Japan.
You get that a little bit over in the West, but yeah, particularly with the way rights to shows and stuff work and the way groups are formed to get this sort of stuff made. I am by no means an expert in this. I am a fucking idiot when it comes to this stuff, but from what little I have researched, it looks like it can get very, very complicated, and the actual talent or the creatives behind this can very often get screwed out of their hard work. What is interesting about Patlabor and the team behind it is that Patlabor seems to have been created by a team of 5 people who knew enough about the anime industry and just the entertainment industry in Japan to preempt a lot of the skullduggery that various different companies and corporations might pull on them. So they formed what is known as Headgear, which is a collective that collaboratively share the rights to Patlabor right out the gate. There's no one person who owns it. There's no one person that has the rights to it. They each share the rights. The original team was Masami Yuki, who is the guy credited with the original idea of Patlabor. He was kind of coming up with it in the 80s. Eventually, it kind of spun up into his manga and then also the anime series that was created. You've then got Kazunori Ito, who is the screenwriter for a lot of it. He's apparently credited with bringing in sort of the grounded and everyday elements, kind of the slice of life stuff that you were talking about, into what what's otherwise a sci-fi story. What's interesting is that all of these guys are well respected and very accomplished in their industries. Kazunori Ito is pretty heavily involved in the Dot Hack franchise,
which is something I know nothing about.
I'm aware that it's a thing and it's extremely popular and apparently very good. I have never watched it and I probably should. So you can tell us a bit about Yutaka Izubuchi.
He's the mecha designer, isn't he? So he's the person who designed the Ingram AV98, and it's just fucking awesome. Like, it's this sleek, cool, Apple-produced mecha. What more do you want? But he was the mecha designer for Char's Counterattack, and is it Exvion, or however you want to pronounce it.
Exvion. We've run into that a bunch. I think he directed that too, didn't he?
I think so. And he's also like designer for Gundam Wing and Kamen Rider Agito as well. Akemi Takada, that's the character designer for Patlabor. I think the only thing she had nothing to do with the third film. She's kind of just a freelance character designer. Done a lot of other like animes, none that I recognize from this list that Dave is making me read out at gunpoint.
Yes, read them. And then finally we've got Mamoru Oshii.
Let's make fun of Dave for how little of Mamoru Oshii's work he has watched.
I've sat and watched a shitload of his stuff over the last couple of days actually, because I had so much time on my hands because someone kept fucking delaying recording of this. Robert.
Suck my cock.
Oshii was actually the last person to be brought into Headgear as a collective. Like, they had a screenwriter, they had, the original manga artist as well. They had a character designer and they had a mecha designer, and they're like, shit, we need a director. Several of them had worked with him on Angel's Egg.
Yeah, which is, Anna worked in that, but it's like a surreal, messed up film, isn't it?
It's fucking weird, yeah.
It's like heavy metal for weebs.
And that's one of the reasons why I think a couple of the guys in Headgear were kind of concerned about getting Oshii on board, because they're like, do we want this guy? Is he gonna make it like all dream sequences and weird shit?
Yes.
So I guess this is a good point to kind of delve into Mamoru Oshii a little bit, because that guy has got a bit of a weird filmography, does he not?
Well, we should really mention Kerberos Saga, which is his most important work, to be perfectly honest, which isn't actually well known in the West at all.
Everyone knows Jinro, but when you say that that's like part 3 of a series, everyone goes, what?
It's not even just part 3, it's like a side story to the Kerberos Saga. It's like...
Kerberos Saga is like fascinating, actually. It's like this alternate history universe where Germany won the war, but it wasn't the Germany that you know, because also the Stauffenberg assassination was successful, and Germany develops the nukes first, and Germany's the one that nukes Japan, and so Germany is the one that occupies Japan. It's the reason why all of the weapons and cars and things like that in Jinro look the way they do. It's a very Oshii kind of series.
I actually think it's kind of a not so subtle commentary upon US imperialism, but
because he's never done that.
No, never.
It's important to note, more than anything with Oshii, and something that will come up in pretty much all of his work that I have seen in some form or another, is that when he was in his youth, he was a bit of a student radical who was heavily involved in a series of protests against US military bases in Japan.
Which we should hastily also bring up the fact that is still a major problem in Japan, because when Americans build bases, they don't leave.
So that kind of politics is infused into all things that Mamoru Oshii does, and so it's why in all of Patlabor, the Americans are this kind of nebulous force in the background that are just there threatening to cause problems potentially, or adding new issues into the story through their actions. They're not positive figures, they're not allies, they are a threat.
The other thing that's quite common in Patlabor is, for example, the Japanese security defense forces are not good guys. They're often depicted as, what's the right way to say, like Illuminati, Freemasonry, crypto glow-in-the-darks that are constantly trying to restore the emperor in his will.
Which brings up another point that Oshii likes to revisit in a lot of his media, which is a serious interest in Imperial Japan.
7 lives for the emperor, Dave. That's all I'm saying.
Yeah, no, he's a student of history. For all he is very much focused on science fiction, he knows his shit.
Another thing he's quite fond of is bringing up works of Mishima, which is someone we've talked about. Whether they've made it into videos, I don't know. But
he's mentioned it in interviews. I wouldn't say he's like super into Mishima, but he like acknowledges that Mishima has hit upon things that I'm also very interested in too. Mishima gets a bad rap, but he seems like a fascinating man.
His books are really good, and Patriotism is a fantastic film, if a 30-minute silent film.
I've seen Patlabor's OVA described as one of the early successes of the original video animation market, which was this kind of burgeoning thing in the late 80s, early 90s, where instead of having to put your shit on television or release it as a film, you could just release it on video. The OVA is kind of a success on that front, in that it was what put them on the map. They very clearly put together Patlabor with the intention of turning it into something. They knew that they could do that. They're all industry professionals. It's why the manga, which is the first thing technically that drops, and the original, I guess you could call it. But even when we say that's the original, one thing that they're very, very careful to do is not state that any of the other Patlabor media is based on the manga. And Yuki, in an interview, he was explaining that that was very, very intentional, because if they said it was based on the manga's publisher would have got involved in future productions, and that would have, in his words, complicated things. So they're really clever with how they approach this. And it's lovely to see, because you've seen so many occasions, as we've mentioned before, like Tomino getting screwed, the Macross team getting screwed.
Didn't also Anno get screwed in something as well?
All of Gainax fucked Anno royally with Evangelion.
He'd said in an interview recently, what was it? After this, Evangelion is done and so am I.
He's just gonna make Ultraman and Godzilla movies forever now, and I support his efforts 100%. I guess we can start with the manga a bit, just very briefly to touch on it, because, yeah, it is, what they originally anticipated it being before they decided to spin it out into the OVA and the films. That is largely the vision of Yuki in that one. I think some of the others have a bit of input. Izubuchi obviously has some input there with like the designs and, the character designs from Takada as well, but what you see in the manga is pretty much Yuki's interpretation on the story. So it's quite different to everything that you'll see in the OVAs. Still the same kind of story beats, but it's a lot more consistent, I guess you could say. It's consistently quite lighthearted and pretty chill in places. I think it gets a bit weirder later on down the line. I only read the first volume just to touch on it and make sure I kind of had covered all of my bases here, but it seems very much more consistent in its approach, whereas when we get onto it, everything else gets a bit fucking weird. But yeah, it's very comfy. It's good for a read. Check it out if you want to. But I don't think we really need to touch on it too much, because let's be honest, I don't know how to show manga on a video.
Just post a whole bunch of Fuda hentai. Someone will
get
excited about it.
Let's move on to the OVA, which is the one that I watched, because the way we've done this is we've kind of split up some of the workload in that I was lazy and I didn't want to watch the television series because it's 46 fucking episodes. So I did the OVA, you've covered the TV series, and then we watched the movies. So yeah, that brings us to Patlabor Early Days, which is the original OVA, directed by Oshii, the whole team at Headgear. Production IG, I think, were involved. No, sorry, I'm talking out my ass. I think this was this Studio Dean?
I have literally no idea.
I should have put this in the notes, but I didn't.
My name's Dave, and I try to be all productive and ready for the episodes. Robert's at fault because he never shows up in time for recording. All he does is shout racial slurs.
I mean...
Anyway,
yeah, the OVA its original run is 6 episodes. There's an extra episode that's tagged on at the end to kind of hype everyone up for the launch of the movie, but we'll get to that later. It's, as we've already explained with Patlabor and its styles, there is a lot of different story types going on here. The tone shifts quite rapidly between episodes. You go from police procedural with heavy comedy doses to like a ghost story with a load of comedy nonsense, and then suddenly you're into this 2-episode arc of quite serious political drama, as there's this coup attempt by some elements of the Japanese self-defense forces, and then we're back to light-hearted comedy police drama as well. Oshii seems to have a thing for jumping between different tones, and that seems to be something that all of Headgear kind of get behind as well, because it's not just him doing it. The way I would say that the OVA works is it's a proof of concept, as I've mentioned. This was them sort of going, look, we're gonna create this to put Patlabor on the map. It'll launch a month after the manga's dropped. We're gonna show them what we can do with this franchise, what we can do with this world. We're going to demonstrate our ability to create this story and use this to kind of market it so that we can produce more stuff. Also, we are going to remain in control of the rights. We're not signing those away. So this is Headgear collectively creating this, and it worked excellently because they got a movie deal out of it and they got a TV series deal out of it. And yeah, it's good. It's weird, but it's good fun, I think. I thoroughly enjoyed it, but I was also very confused at points because like, why are they doing a ghost story now? Like, last episode, it was...
Don't think about it. We gotta get a space, Dave.
They don't go to space.
Well, it's not Trigger, so, Trigger presents Patlabor.
I'd watch the shit out of that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, we should talk about the first film. And the first film doesn't have a lot going for it in terms of plot. Basically, there's a bad dude doing bad things. That's not explained. He's just bad.
And really, really into Bible quotes.
They've literally just thrown, you know what? Let's just make a cool drama. Also Jesus and stuff. Oh, he's called Jehovah? Yeah, sure, why not?
It's an Oshii production, so naturally there's got to be at least 5 biblical references.
Do you know what the best thing about this? This was all concepts from Lupin III that were never used.
I've heard about this.
Oshii was making Lupin III film, and he basically wrote all this stuff, and the people behind Lupin III went, we're not making this. What is wrong with you? And he was like, fine, I'll do my own thing.
And he literally then did. The madman.
And like, it's hard to explain the first film where like the plot doesn't matter, the storyline doesn't matter. It's literally just, you know what, we need to fill some bit before we get to the last 30 minutes of mecha action, and then it's a movie.
It's a fairly simple police procedural investigative sort of thing, but it's largely existing to create a situation where special vehicles have to storm a building.
My favorite thing about the plot is like the one character's going away doing all this investigation and computer things, and there's 2 scenes at the end after he's completed all his investigation, figured out the plot, unraveled the conspiracy. The mechanic who was supposed to install the operating system, which was to take over all the labours to allow this awful plan of using wind to cause disruption and destroy Tokyo. He's like, oh, I just didn't install it. It seemed kind of spooky to me. And then Goto, after he's unraveled everything, is like, yeah, no, I'd already figured this out. I just wanted you to figure it out by yourself. Like, and it's just like, I wasted 40 minutes of my life.
No, but Robert, they're putting you in the shoes of Shinohara in that moment when he gets made fun
just
of
like
by
the monsters
Goto.
fight. I mean, mechas.
And that's basically what it is set up for. And then it is, 35, 40 minutes of hype mecha battles on the Ark where they try and stop the plan of the bad dude, which is inspired by the Bible in some way.
Jesus and stuff. I don't know. Mormons are the bad guys. Just roll with it. Oh, we should review the Mormon Jesus anime.
If we're doing that, then we have to review the one that Om Shinrikyo made, because there is actually an anime by Om Shinrikyo.
But only if we also are allowed to do the Star Trek animated series just to annoy you.
We're not doing that.
But there's like a sexy cat lady, Dave. What more
don't
do you
care.
want? But yeah, so Patlabor the movie, it's just fun yet again within Patlabor. It's just a vehicle for a story. The story happens to be very light, and the story is all about mecha action. Patlabor has this thing where the story is either action or a story, which is quite interesting within mecha itself.
You raise an interesting point there. Like, if you compare the 2 movies, Patlabor 1 and 2 kind of represent the dichotomy of the series as a whole. Like, on one hand, you've got Patlabor 1. It's pretty simple. It's largely an excuse to have a big hype mecha fight at the end of the film. Patlabor 2 is when Oshii kind of takes the reins and he's like, now we're going to talk about politics, kids. And it gets a bit weird. But actually, no, before we do that, because I guess we're following the timeline of the release dates, I believe the TV series dropped.
So the TV series is basically a slice of life anime. It's comfy, for a lack of a better word. It follows very similar to what we've already discussed. There's episodes with, well, showcase different bits of characters. It will show mecha action. It doesn't really have a heavy plot couple of episodes. It's just a fucking early 90s anime show where it was like, there's a bit of mecha action, there's a bit of police action, there's ghosts.
But they don't suddenly have like 2 episodes where the JSDF are invading Tokyo.
Not really, no. There is elements of military conspiracy and wacky weird shit, and like inventing super powerful labors that get loose, which is kind of like something Oshii repeats in Ghost in the Shell, but this review isn't about Ghost in the Shell. It's a pretty by-the-numbers police procedural with labors, where it like introduces concepts about labors and how they're changing criminality as well as how they're changing police work. It's just a good show that you should watch.
It seems like, particularly the TV series, like with the OVA, Oshii directs it, the usual guys write it, but Oshii has this thing where he kind of takes front and center of most of the things he's directly involved with. Whereas I think with the TV series, he's not the writer or director of all of the episodes. It's a more collaborative thing, and so I think you get more of a picture of Headgear as a whole in that, rather than just Oshii kind of taking the reins and doing Oshii shit.
It's a simpler show, shall we say.
Do you see as much of like the environmentalist themes that pop up in kind of the background of most of it? Like you've usually got like various different terrorist groups.
Yeah, that's basically the main driving plot of the TV series. It's like these different elements of, and like all of Tokyo is like a construction site, and all of Japan is basically being built up. It's kind of this overarching theme of Oshii's work, basically.
He's got a thing. He knows what he likes, which include basset hounds. He puts basset hounds in fucking everything.
Man likes his dogs with long ears.
It's cool. It's a cool dog, I guess. I'll give you that. Yeah, how would you say the TV series compares to the films?
It's very much like the first film. So a lot of the time, the episode is just kind of like building to mecha action. Like the first episode introduces Noah as like a young cadet who's going through her labor testing program whilst SV2 is getting their new Ingram. Someone steals the Ingram, but Noah's obsessed with it because she's a massive weeb and has to go and rescue it. That's the kind of idea of the show where it's like, it's that whole, that show I didn't like that everyone gets mad at me for not liking.
Gunbuster?
Yeah, it uses a lot of elements from that. Well, I'm saying uses elements. It's probably where Gunbuster got it from, where it's like they're training to use the labors and they're doing push-ups and crap like that. And so it's that kind of idea. It's a very simple cop show with robots.
I guess that brings us to Patlabor 2, the movie, and in classic Robert fashion, I believe you finished it 2 hours ago?
Yes. I've seen it before, though. It's the classic Dave position. Robert, please watch this thing you've watched before, but I don't want to.
I want it fresh in your memory, boy. We are professionals.
Are we?
No, we are not, in any way, shape, or form. As we mentioned earlier, there are two sides to the Patlabor. There's the zany slice-of-life comedy side, and then there's the bit when Oshii takes the reins and turns it into...
Metal Gear, the anime.
Patlabor 2 is probably the most celebrated of the series. It's the one that I've seen discussed the most.
Patlabor 2 is this huge treaty on how US imperialism has affected Japan, the shifts it's done in Japanese culture. It's done wonderfully. It explains exactly what's going on at the time and how the feeling was in Japan about its place in the world. And it's done with giant mechas. Like, it's all this grand discussion about the politics of the Japanese Self-Defense Force and its place within Japanese society, and also fantastic concepts like just war and fraudulent peace, and it's just it's such a good anime.
It's
like,
amazing.
People forget about it because Ghost in the Shell had a mecha and the arms ripped off the hot sexy lady. I'm like, no. Fuck Ghost in the Shell.
What's interesting is Oshii got the position of director for Ghost in the Shell largely based off of his work on Patlabor 2. A lot of the guys that you saw working on Patlabor 2 would go on to work on Ghost in the Shell. In many ways, you could kind of consider Patlabor 2 kind of the dry run for Ghost in the Shell, because not only is Oshii directing, you've also got Kazunori Ito writing the screenplay, the art director for Patlabor 2. He's an interesting one, because one of the things you'll notice about Patlabor 2 almost immediately is that it looks very different to everything else in the franchise.
It completely changes its style. Even the characters look largely different. The only thing that doesn't actually change is the mechas, but they add flak vests for no actual good reason if you think about it.
Other than the fact that it looks cool as hell. I think, and this is just me speculating, I must stress, this is the first time I think we see Hiromasa Ogura stepping into the Patlabor franchise. He's the art director for this. I don't think he'd worked on Patlabor stuff before. Could be talking out my ass there, but he goes on to be the art director for Ghost in the Shell as well. And if you look at the art styles between Patlabor 2 and Ghost in the Shell, very similar, and I think that's Ogura's influence you're seeing there. And both of them are produced by Production IG as well. So you see a lot of parallels between Ghost in the Shell and Patlabor 2. That being said, I think Patlabor 2 might be better. Don't get me wrong, fantastic movie. I think Patlabor 2 has more to say.
Ghost in the Shell is a fantastic anime. I am not in any way deriding Ghost in the Shell. I think the problem with Ghost in the Shell is it's revered because people aren't aware of things like Patlabor. Yeah, Ghost in the Shell's for plebs. This is the true Kino.
Yeah, I guess we should probably talk about the plot a little bit of Patlabor 2. I think it's 2 years after the first film, so it follows on from that. Everyone's kind of moved on from the unit a wee bit. Ota is an instructor at the academy. Noah and Shinohara are helping to develop new labors elsewhere. It's really just Goto and Nagamo who are still at the unit, which is really interesting because even in this one, we're shifting the focus a little bit. We don't have the usual squad. They're only really there at the end. The majority of this film, the central focal points are Goto and Nagamo, who have largely been on the sidelines in the OVA at least. But basically, there is a bombing of the Tokyo Bridge, which is believed to have been done either by the Japanese self-defense forces or possibly the Americans. They're not sure. This whole breakdown of communications begins between civil authorities and military authorities. authorities. The networks start getting hacked by outside parties. Everyone doesn't trust anyone, and Goto and Nagamo are racing against this conspiracy, basically, because they've discovered that all of these incidents are connected, and they are being orchestrated by this rogue self-defense forces officer called Suge, and they're being helped along as well by this extremely creepy looking intelligence officer called Arakawa as well, who's a very important figure within the movie.
Not to bring up Mishima, but like, it's this idea that there's people disheartened with military leadership and are attempting to take over. Like, they're like a private militia trying to assert dominance over the Japanese self-defense force and restate Japan's position in the world. But there's a lot of like, is that actually what they're doing?
Suge's incredibly nuanced, and it's Oshii kind of trying to discuss the position that Japan was in, and kind of still is in at the time in terms of its position within the world.
Did you pick up on the date that is on the videotape of the plane incident?
No, I was trying to find that when I was going through the footage, but yeah, that's one thing that we're going to need to talk about, because this is another thing that Oshii likes to do. Oshii likes his history, and Oshii likes to reference back to things. In this case, I believe on the videotape, it's the numbers 226. Is that correct, Robert?
Correct.
Would you like to tell people about the 226 incident?
It is a coup by Japanese ultranationalists, but at the time everyone was ultranationalists, so that's kind of like an oxymoron. They were specifically the young officers. They were young cadets who tried to take control of the Japanese government, end the democratic diet, democratic in big quotations there, and reinstate power to the emperor and go and crush communists.
And also murder a bunch of people in the process as well.
They're politicians. They don't count as people, Dave. They're merely,
Most of them were generals and stuff, because it was
they're
still
politicians, Dave. But yeah, basically they failed. Then we got World War II.
Pretty much, yeah. You had, at the time in the Imperial Army, it was heavily factionalized, but the two dominant factions, you had the Imperial Way.
Is it the Kodoha?
You've got Kodoha, or Imperial Way, and Toseiha, or Control Faction. Control Faction are more sympathetic to fascism from the more German-style fascism. The
basic way it can be explained is they had the Northern Road and the Southern Road. And the Northern Road is the Imperial Way, which was expansion into the Soviet Union, and the Southern Road was expansion into China.
Which they've been doing a lot of at the time.
They'd already taken Manchuria by this point. The young officer coup is basically the two different factions trying to kill each other, and one group won.
And it wasn't the Imperial Way. Spoiler alert. They all got shot.
It's hard to explain how violent Japanese politics was in the 30s.
Government by assassination is how it's often described, in that you would have these armed groups who were like, I don't like the guy who's in charge at the minute. How do we deal with that?
Just shoot him.
But at the time, there was also this culture of, if you are murking dudes for the emperor, which is what all of these guys would claim they're doing, is like, I'm doing this out of love of the emperor, out of national spirit, everyone would say, no, he's just a good lad, he's just a bit wayward, his heart was in the right place, go easy on him. So you could get away with crazy shit.
You could get away with murder.
Quite multiple murders in some cases. At the time of the 226 incident, you'd had just the year before what's known as the Aizawa incident. So the Aizawa incident is kind of the final outcome of a previous coup attempt by the Imperial Way faction, because they do that a lot, where they believed that this coup attempt that they'd made had been scuppered by their rivals in the Control Faction. And one of the ultimate outcomes of that was one of their guys, quote unquote, a general by the name of Masaki, had been removed from his position of Inspector General of Military Education for the Imperial Army. And so, in response to that, another Imperial Way officer, Lieutenant Colonel Saburo Aizawa, decided that he was going to walk into the office of Masaki's successor, who was a Control Faction Major General known as Nagata, and kill him with a sword, because these people have no fucking chill.
The 30s were a really base time, okay?
The 30s were a very interesting time in Japan and the rest of the world, but...
A base time, Dave. The correct term is base.
No, it's not. You would have been part of this fucking coup, wouldn't you?
7 lives for the Emperor, Dave.
Ultimately, it kind of fizzles out after a day, after they've successfully bumped off a couple of their political rivals. They have about 2,000 troops. They get surrounded by 20,000 loyalist soldiers and are forced to disband. The people involved are arrested, and they've learned from that previous incident that I mentioned, so there's no big fancy trial. They get court-martialed and quietly put into a room and shot. The Control Faction solidifies their control over Japan, and their way of doing things continues, and the era of government by assassination comes to an end. It's a fascinating era of Japanese history, and one that Oshii is a big fan of, because the central plot point of Patlabor II, the whole idea of this rogue military element within the Japanese self-defense forces creating this incident, is entirely inspired by this earlier 226 incident. One of the ways that you'll see that is a very cool touch. Like on the night before the 226 incident, snows heavily over Tokyo. The rebels see this as a good omen, as it were.
It's to do with, is it the Sakura Daemon, which is the end of the shogunate, if I remember rightly?
Oshii is coding his reference into that, where you have all of these tanks driving into Tokyo, and then it begins to snow, and that's clearly harkening back to this 226 incident. The one other sort of element that we should talk about within Patlabor 2, because this is another theme that Oshii is really keen to hit home about. When we open in the movie, we have these Japanese self-defense forces soldiers deployed with labors in, I think it's implied to be Cambodia, and they're operating under the conventions of Article 9. So you're allowed to deploy abroad, but you aren't really allowed to engage enemy forces. You are there purely for peacekeeping purposes.
Even then, Article 9 does not necessarily allow that. That's one interpretation of Article 9. The actual language of Article 9 is aspiring sincerely to an international peace based on justice and order, the Japanese people forever renounce war as the sovereign right of the nation and threat of or use of forces as means of settling international disputes. In order to accomplish this aim of the preceding paragraph, land, sea, and air forces, as well as other war potential, will never be maintained. The right of belligerency of the state will not be recognized. There isn't a lot of room for argument. It's not like the Second Amendment in the US, where it's like the right to bear arms and a well-maintained militia is necessary for the rest of the sentence.
Who cares?
Basically, yeah.
Americans really care.
They really care. Whereas like in Japan, it's like the army and military does not exist. So the self-defense forces are not an army. Although there is a Ministry of Defense, it was the National Safety Agency. There's a lot of debate after 9/11. They put troops to, like you say, Iraq. But there was a lot of fucking fighting domestically in Japan to not allow them. So like Japan has always had this weird, there's a strong element of pacifism. There's a strong element of like making money from war. There's people who like actually the area of the world we're in is not actually that secure. And then there's like the nationalist element. They're like, we should be allowed to have an army. Why are we still under occupation? But Japan has this strange political argument about its military because of World War II. And it's a really difficult position Japan finds itself in because they don't want to encourage any form of militarism.
And yet they also want to profit from militarism.
Like, people talk about Japanese economic boom after the war. Japanese economic boom after the war was only because of the Korean War. Japan was the closest country that the West had access to. Basically, Japan's economy was fucked after the war because, we bombed it to death.
Firebombing will do that to a country.
And the thing was the only way the Americans could get ready for Korea was to have somewhere they could station troops for long enough to train them up, even for things like medical evacs, and as well as getting just logistically ready for it, because you can't ship everything to Guam and then go to Korea. Korea's fucking miles away from Guam. So where was the nearest base? It was Japan. And so America pumps all this money into the Japanese economy and props it up. It starts propping up its government as well. Like, although the Americans were occupying the Japanese, it wasn't like a West Berlin, West Germany situation where the European powers propped up Berlin to fight the Soviets. Japan became a logistics area for the entire, well, what would have been Sito at the time. But basically there was this logistic staging area for the Korean War, and because of the raw material needed for the Korean War, which the Japanese had in terms of steel and production and engines and everything and armaments, and yeah, that's where the Japanese economic boom comes from. So this argument that Japan pretends to be, and pretends it's the right word, uninvolved in offensive wars. Japan's hugely funded and invested in all this military action, where like companies like Mitsubishi, and they're still producing armaments, and the Japanese like to pretend they're this pacifist nation.
There's a contradiction in how Japan has been forced in some ways to exist as a nation. Like, obviously they have Article 9, which prevents them from having a formal armed force. They've got the self-defense forces, but they are subjugated to civilian authorities, and they are not allowed to operate in a military fashion on foreign soil. Up until the point where they started to do that, you've also got another element that Oshii brings up quite regularly in his movies, like the idea of, and we mentioned this earlier, the US as this quite nebulous force that isn't necessarily an ally, because, you know, the US did bomb the shit out of them and then begin to prop their economy up again, as you were describing. But then when you get into like the 70s and 80s and 90s, Japan's economy starts to outstrip the US's. It starts to do better in growing markets, and the Americans get a bit funny about that and start, you know, raising a bit of a stink. You know, hang on a minute, how are these guys better at car manufacturing and electronics manufacturing? How are they overtaking us in these areas? We're America. We're supposed to be the best at this. And so it's this really weird shaking hands with the right and holding a dagger behind your back with the left relationship that Japan and America have. And that's something that you see depicted in Patlabor 2. What you were talking about a minute ago as well, though, with like that dichotomy between various different elements of Japanese politics is exactly what Patlabor 2 is about. I think the central and probably the most important sequence in that entire film is the monologue between Goto and Arakawa as they're like panning through the canals and like the waterways of Tokyo, and you can kind of see all of these like the relics of industry, basically, these forgotten buildings and the after effects of all this construction that's going on in Tokyo at the time. And these two characters basically represent the conflicting sides of this story. On one side, you've got Arakawa, who is basically describing what you've been talking about, Rob, this whole idea of Japan is living under this false peace where they pretend that they are a pacifist nation that is not involved in these conflicts, and yet they absolutely 100% are, and it is this false peace that should be destroyed. And Goto's counter to that is he's the pacifist faction, effectively, in this. He is that counter argument to it. It's like, even if this is a dirty peace, and even if it is a false peace, it's still peace, and it must be preserved because that's what we're about. And it's a very beautiful sequence.
It's really strange to be talking specifically on our show about a mecha series, and we're actually able to discuss politics beyond Zeon bad, Freddy's a good. Whereas in like this example, there isn't a good guy here. There are arguments to be made for both sides. Yes, pacifism and peace is a wonderful thing, but like it's that element of, is the Japanese self-defense force here, who are basically trying to nationalize themselves within the, like an element is creating this thing where they can expel the invaders, expel the barbarians, and gain control of their sovereign nation so they can have the true peace they want? Or is it Goto's approach where it's like, even if this peace is bad, it's peace, as you say. Does it really matter that we're not able to control our military and stuff compared to the value of security?
To go back to what we were talking about at the start with the opening scene where you have Suge and the laborers unable to fire on these insurgent forces that they've encountered, which results in basically everyone in the unit, apart from Suge, being wiped out. If I had to try and interpret what I think Suge's motives are, and what's interesting is you never hear Suge explain what he was about. Arakawa is the only one who kind of gives you the pitch for what these rebels are trying to do. My take, I think what Suge is aiming for in this is he's a man who has been to war, who has kind of seen the paradox of what the modern Japanese military is, like this whole idea of we are a self-defense force, we have renounced violence, and yet we are involved in the industry of war. We are sending troops abroad, but we are not letting them engage, and the result is all of my men died, and we are still pretending that this isn't, you know, sending troops abroad. And what he tries to do with his 226 incident, effectively, is bring the war home to Japan and force people at home to recognize this paradox that they're living under by having tanks rolling through the streets of Tokyo, by having this attack on the city. But you never hear it explained, and you can only kind of interpret what Suge was after from the few times we kind of see him on screen. So it's a really interesting and interpretive kind of approach that they have to the film. You can read into it a lot and you can draw your own conclusions. I'm sure what I've described there, someone else would disagree with entirely. And that's what's great about this movie. Even though it's about giant robots storming a base at the end of it, it's got so much to say.
It's just a really good movie. Like, it's hard in terms of us reviewing it because it brings up so many interesting political points that we could spend days picking apart.
I have read multiple essays on this film.
Whereas it's a case of, just go and fucking watch it and think about it. It's beautifully animated, it's beautifully written, and it's just go and fucking watch it and come back to us in the comments and we'll tell you you're wrong. Like,
it's a fantastic movie. It really is. If there is one thing that you take from this video, all of the stuff, apart from maybe the one we're about to discuss, is excellent, 100% worth your time. If you pick one, pick Patlabor 2, the movie. It is incredible. One of the best mecha films ever made. Probably one of the best anime films ever made. I can't believe it's taken me this fucking long to watch it. Jesus Christ. Yeah, there's one final film that I guess we need to take off the list. If we were doing the core...
I hasten to add, I've never seen Patlabor 3. I didn't know it existed.
Well, surprise. It's a really weird one. So you've got WX or W13, Patlabor in the movie 3. This is kind of the odd one out of the core Patlabor franchise in that it had one of the most delayed productions in anime history, because this one, I believe, entered into production in 1994. So a year after Patlabor 2 dropped, they began work on this. But it was originally intended as like this side story where it was going to be an OVA originally, and it's based on a manga storyline from the Patlabor manga. But even in the context of it being an adaptation of the manga story arc, it's still really weird because it takes that story arc and adapts it. And by adapts it, I mean it takes Special Vehicles 2 and takes them out of the story pretty much completely. Special Vehicles 2 appear for about 15 minutes in this movie. This movie is an hour and 40 minutes.
Okay, I no longer care. End of review.
It's barely a Patlabor movie, to be honest. It's an interesting enough movie. It's kind of a kaiju plot line. There's these weird attacks that are happening along the sort of harbors and coast of Tokyo, and it's related to this scientific research that's been going on for this chemical that was discovered in Antarctica or something. It's like, I don't know, like The Thing meets a bit of a kaiju movie. Special Vehicles don't really show up until an hour and 15 minutes into the movie, and then they fight the monster and that's it. But the rest of the movie is focused on these two detectives who, as far as I'm aware, didn't appear in any of the previous movies or TV series.
Okay.
It's such a weird movie, man, because it's not directed by Oshii. It's not written by any of the usual folks. It doesn't have most of the core team from Headgear involved. I don't know. I wouldn't say it's a bad movie. It's decent in its own right. It doesn't feel like a Patlabor movie, if you know what I mean. It doesn't have any of the elements that have made me enjoy the previous OVAs and films so much. Like, we don't have Noah being bubbly and enthusiastic about robots. You don't have Ota getting over-aggressive. You don't have Goto doing something clever and underhanded to turn the situation to his advantage. There is none of that. It's just these two characters that we've never seen before running about trying to solve a mystery, and then the characters that we're actually interested in seeing show up at the end. I think I would have got more out of it if it had been specifically marketed as a side story to Patlabor, but it's not marketed as that. It's specifically called Patlabor 3, the follow-up to one of the greatest anime movies of all time. And so it just doesn't work as much for me. That's Patlabor the movie 3. Don't watch it. It's not really a Patlabor.
End of review.
So, with that, we come to the conclusion. As always, Robert, do you have any parting thoughts on all of Patlabor?
Watch it, fuckers. Also, stop asking for Votums. I'm not reviewing it.
Why do you hate Votums so much?
It's that classic. There's like 90 series of this one show. You should totally review it. I'm like, no, we're not doing this.
So the exact same problem that we've had with Patlabor in the where the fuck do we start? All right, fuck it, let's just do all of it.
Votums is worse.
Yeah, sorry it took us so long to actually get around to Patlabor. It's fucking excellent. This was a bit of a different one, so hopefully people aren't, expecting us to actually dive into all of the should you watch it and stuff. Yes, is the pure and simple answer. I have no complaints about this series. It's fascinating. The people behind it are fascinating. Patlabor 2 is one of the best anime movies ever made. Thank you very much for watching.
Why, yes, you should subscribe to our channel already. Also, the illegal state of Ireland must stop this.
That's a hot take right there, Robert.
See, if I was better on Mishima's quotes, I would find one for you. Oh no, I seen the word aesthetics there. Let's see if we get it.
If we start quoting Mishima, we are 100% getting cancelled by somebody.
Why, yes, I do believe in bodybuilding and being gay.